Good day, Black Knight scholars. Mr. Deegan back at it with Unit 9, the Cold War, Modern India, and Modern Africa, and Lesson 4, the end, the finish, the stop of the Cold War. Here is the main symbol of the Cold War being torn down. It is the Berlin Wall. We'll talk about that now. First, two guiding questions. How did the Cold War end? And what happened to Germany and the Soviet Union after the Cold War? The division of Germany and its Berlin Wall were key symbols of the Cold War. And here's the same map we saw in Lesson 1, showing West Germany being controlled by Britain, the US, and France, and East Germany being controlled by the communist country of the Soviet Union. And let's take a look at Berlin. Berlin is a city entirely within East Germany. But if you look at the right here, this is Berlin. And within Berlin, there was a divide. West Berlin was controlled by the US, France, and Britain. And East Berlin was controlled by the Soviet Union. And all around West Berlin in the 1960s to the 1980s, there was a wall. Why was the Berlin Wall built in the first place? Let's talk about it. First, it was built on August 31st, 1961. And you see East German officials building the wall brick by brick. When did this wall fall? 28 years later, on November 9th, 1989. East Germany built a wall made of barbed wire and concrete to, quote, keep the Western fascists out of East Germany, the East German government said. But what was the real reason that this wall was built? Well, it was built to prevent East German citizens from defecting or escaping to West Berlin, which had more jobs and a democratic government, and West Berlin overall had a better quality of life than East Berlin and East Germany. And as I said, for 28 years, East Germany was cut off from West Berlin and the rest of West Germany. Let's talk about three important world leaders who helped end the Cold War. First, US President Ronald Reagan, who was president from 1981 to 1989. Next, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Here she is, next to Reagan, and she was in power from 1979 until 1990. Lastly, the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. And here is Gorbachev to the right of Thatcher. He was leader of the Soviet Union from 1985 until 1991. What did Ronald Reagan accomplish? He called the Soviet Union the evil empire in the beginning of his reign. And was this a show of US strength, or did it cause more division in the world? That's an open question, because language matters when you're a leader. Reagan also developed the Strategic Defense Initiative in 1983, and this was a plan to install weapons in outer space to protect the US from Soviet nuclear missiles. He heated up the arms race, did Reagan. Lastly, he signed an agreement with the USSR's Gorbachev to eliminate medium-range nuclear missiles toward the end of his presidency. So he was able to get along with the Soviet Union's last leader. His most important and memorable speech was the Tear Down This Wall speech on June 12, 1987 in West Berlin. Here's a picture of Ronald Reagan at the podium, and Reagan's strong, direct demand to Gorbachev and the Soviet Union showed the world that the US was strong and that it meant business. We're going to see now an excerpt from Reagan's speech. Enjoy.
Today I say, as long as this gate is closed, as long as this scar of a wall is permitted to stand, it is not the German question alone that remains open, but the question of freedom for all mankind. In the 1950s, Khrushchev predicted, "We will bury you." But in the West today, we see a free world that has achieved a level of prosperity and well-being unprecedented in all human history. In the communist world, we see failure. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In addition to Reagan, we have Margaret Thatcher. What did this British Prime Minister accomplish? Well, she was the first female Prime Minister of Britain. She earned the nickname Iron Lady. And she believed in free trade and less government regulation of business. In other words, she believed in free enterprise capitalism because she thought capitalism creates jobs and wealth for all people who participate in this economic activity. Thatcher also developed a close relationship with the United States, especially Ronald Reagan. Here you see the two of them sharing a light moment. And Thatcher also asserted Britain's military power. One example was when she sent British troops to Argentina, the South American country, to punish Argentinian government for invading the Falkland Islands, which was still a British colony. So here's the southern tip of South America. Here's Argentina. And to the east, you see the Falkland Islands. Thatcher asserted her military power on these islands, proving that she deserves to be called the Iron Lady. And what was her personality like? Well, here is her iron-like ladiness. She was feisty, she was assertive, she was confident. She never backed down from a verbal argument with politicians who didn't agree with her free market ideas. And you're about to see an example of that. She is in British Parliament in this clip you're about to see, and she is not backing down from her critics.
I give way to the honourable gentleman.
There is no doubt that the Prime Minister has in many ways achieved substantial success. There is one statistic that I understand is not, however, challenged, and that is that over her 11 years, the gap between the richest 10% and the poorest 10% in this country has widened substantially. How can she say at the end of her chapter of British politics that she can justify many people in a constituency such as mine being relatively much poorer off, much less well housed, and much less well provided than it was in 1979? Surely she accepts that is not a record that she or any Prime Minister can be proud of.
Mr. Speaker, all levels of income are better off than they were in 1979. But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have. And what a policy! Yes, he would rather have the poor poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That is the Liberal policy. Yes, it came out. He didn't intend it to, but he did. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm extremely grateful. The Prime Minister is aware that I detest every single one of her domestic policies, and I've never had that.
And I think that the honourable gentleman knows that I have the same contempt for his socialist policies as the people of East Europe who have experienced it have in Japan. I think I must have hit the right nail on the head when I pointed out that the logic of those policies are they'd rather have the poor poorer. Once they start to talk about the gap, they'd rather the gap was that. Down here. That. Not that. But that. So long as the gap is smaller, so long as the gap is smaller, they'd rather have the poor poorer. You do not create wealth and opportunity that way. You do not create a property-owning democracy that way.
From Thatcher to Gorbachev, what did Mikhail Gorbachev accomplish? He was the last president of the Soviet Union before it collapsed in 1991. Gorbachev had a good working relationship with both Reagan and Thatcher. And Gorbachev won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990. Why? He introduced two major reforms to the USSR to make the Soviet Union less communist and more democratic. And these two reforms were Perestroika and glasnost. What were Perestroika and glasnost? Well, you see here, they were the opposite of communism ideas, and Time magazine's cover shows that Gorbachev turns his back on Lenin and the idea of communism. Lenin's in the background, and starting over, Gorbachev is in the foreground with his ideas. Perestroika was the idea of restructuring the Soviet economy to add more capitalist ideas, such as private property and private business ownership. Meanwhile, glasnost, which literally translates from Russian to English as openness, meant creating more freedom of speech for citizens and less secrecy and therefore less corruption in the Soviet government. Gorbachev, Thatcher, and Reagan were all in power when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. And this was a symbolic victory for Germany and for the idea of democracy. How did it happen? On November 9th, the spokesman for the East Berlin Communist Party said that starting at midnight, citizens of East Germany were free to cross into West Berlin and West Germany. The guards who had guarded this wall would no longer prevent people from going over it. And about a year later, on October 3rd, 1990, the governments of East and West Germany were officially unified, and Germany once again was one united country. And here you see a gentleman who is tearing down the wall with an axe, while behind him you see a gentleman who's on a ladder about to go over the Berlin Wall. How did the Soviet Union fall in 1991? Let's talk about this. The Soviet satellite countries around the Soviet Union started demanding more freedom, and we're starting to see the drawbacks, the bad parts to communism. So, in December 1991, there was a meeting, and 11 of these Soviet satellite countries announced that they were leaving the Soviet Union. And as a result, Gorbachev's radical reforms, which led to more openness, freer elections, led to the USSR's collapse. And Mikhail Gorbachev was so disappointed that he resigned as leader on December 25th, 1991. And this cartoon shows how the Soviet Union ship is sinking once all of these smaller countries around the Soviet Union start to become independent and no longer rely on this Soviet Union ship. That is it, ladies and gentlemen. Please answer your summary questions for your full 30 points. And preview for next lesson, we're going to be talking about modern India and Gandhi and modern Africa, led by Nelson Mandela. Until that time, this is Mr. Deegan signing off.